William Faulkner, or Ernest Hemingway, or Arthur Quiller Cooch? Jesus, it's hard to source a quote online. Is the author of the 1916 work On the Art of Writing. In what has become its most famous quote, the author professes this piece of wisdom. If you hear, I'm doing the voice because it's a quote, roll with it, require a practical rule of me, I will present you with this. Whenever you feel an impulse to perpetrate a piece of exceptionally fine writing, obey it wholeheartedly and delete it before sending your manuscript to press. Murder your darlings. This quote urges writers to reevaluate beloved, personally meaningful, and fun-to-write characters that ultimately do not serve a story. It asks authors to do the hardest thing imaginable, reconsider characters, events, and places they believe to be their best, and kill them. On an unrelated note, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is the best card in Yu-Gi-Oh! But first, this video is sponsored by HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. It takes the worst parts out of cooking and makes it simple and easy. If you're looking to stay healthy this year, HelloFresh has more options to support your wellness journey than ever before. Dig into their biggest menu yet, with over 45 dinner options and even more market items that suit any lifestyle. If you're like me and have a schedule too busy to spend time cooking, try HelloFresh's lineup of quick and easy meals, including 15-minute recipes designed to minimize stress and maximize time spent savoring your supper. Not a morning person? Do you struggle to get yourself going? Do you keep missing the Tuesday streams? Well, HelloFresh is also here to kickstart a new year of nutritious and delicious recipes to beat the morning blues with free breakfast. You heard that right. When you join HelloFresh, you will get free breakfast for life. That's really what they're offering? We're talking about one completely free breakfast item packed into your HelloFresh box as long as your subscription is active. I cook pretty frequently with my wife, and HelloFresh takes all the worry about what's in the fridge away, leaving us with the fun of cooking delicious meals together. Their pre-portioned ingredients in the box and simple recipes make cooking an enjoyable activity for anyone. Click the link in the description or scan my QR code and use the code MBTFREE to get free breakfast for life. One breakfast item per box as long as your subscription is active. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is played in almost every single deck that's topped in the last 5 years of the game. It's the most played hand trap in every single Yu-Gi-Oh format where it's legal, with one exception that necessitates its use. Go to our Yu-Gi-Oh and you'll see players bemoaning it. Go to pro players' YouTubes and you'll see them calling it S tier. There's no question. If you want to win games, you'd better be playing the best. And the best is Ash Blossom. Right? Today, I want to explore an alternative understanding of the card. Like the darlings that litter the pages of awful YA, Ash Blossom has become somewhat of a comfort character within awful locals lists. It's included within decks for a multitude of reasons. A general vague sense that it's good, a strange feeling of compulsion, a mode of thinking that because it's in so many good lists, it has to be a good card, the fact that no matter what you're playing against, it always does something. But format to format, its applications change drastically, and a must-play in one format may not serve your purposes in another. Today, I'd like us not only to examine Ash Blossom's place in the current metagame, but also to identify a thought pattern that might be hampering your success as a duelist. It's time to consider murdering our darling. Let me give you a little bit of insight into the thought patterns I'm talking about. I was pawing through Runic profiles last week. If you're unfamiliar, Runic is a deck that plays on a different axis than most Yu-Gi-Oh strategies. The archetype is a series of modal spells that can function either as removal or special summon a fusion monster from your extra deck. In general, a deck that's composed entirely of 1-for-1 removal spells isn't a good call, especially when a card like Snake Eye Ash can garner 6 or 7 cards worth of advantage. However, Runic's field spell, Runic Fountain, allows you to recycle Runic spells, complicating conventional card knowledge about removal. MST isn't playable in 2024, but an MST that draws you a card, well, that's something else. Since Runic Fountain can only recycle cards a singular time, Runic decks have to guarantee they're able to find the maximum number of Runic spells in any given hand. As a result, they often max out on every Runic card with any utility whatsoever, and sometimes ones without much utility at all, just for names. The result is a deck that bucks traditional understandings of deck building, and plays a ton all but mandatory cards. Modern Runic decks, Runic Sprite Furhire, Bestial Runic, Runic Generator, and Runic Goatee have a very inflexible main deck, usually with only about 3 cards total for non-engine. And what non-engine do you think they play? In the profile I watched, they played Ash Blossom. When they revealed the card, they said, "You gotta." why do you gotta? It makes sense on a very basic level. Ash Blossom is the most represented, and therefore the best, card in competitive play. You've got 3 spaces for non-engine. You might as well play the best possible card, but I urge you to resist that thought pattern. Instead of thinking critically about why you're playing an individual card, you're deferring to an understanding of play rates. Play rates of a card in completely different contexts, in completely different decks, alongside completely different main deck options. And again, the consequences for misapplying this slot are super high. This is your only piece of non-engine in the deck. It's gotta be good. Instead, I ask you to be willing to murder your darling. Enter an examination of Ash Blossom's slot with a willingness to cut it. It's very possible you'll realize that much of Ash's strength comes from its use alongside a second hand trap, and in a list with so few non-engine slots, you're better off following Dinkabui's lead and playing an equalizer that might trade for more cards. It's very possible you don't play any non-engine at all. If Ash is just going to trade for 1 point of interaction, you might as well sub it out for even more Runic spells that do the same but offer more flexibility for your linear strategy. It's even possible you do land on Ash Blossom. Maybe your worst matchup completely folds to it, but whatever conclusions you draw, I ask you to do them without any presuppositions. Rather than just tossing out a "you gotta," here's an example of that thought process in action. We're considering playing Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring in our deck. Let's begin by thinking about the use cases for the card. At present, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about as close to a Tier 0 format as we have ever been. Almost any use of this card is going to be against a deck packing Snake Eyes, and probably Fire King. First up, conventional wisdom is that if you see a Fire King island, it's a pretty good target for Ash Blossom. Responding to the island with an Ash Blossom prevents the destruction of a monster, which prevents access to Runics, which prevents access to Kirin. However, this supposes they have no other access to the Fire King line. Many of these decks are on 3 Kirin already. It's just as likely that they naturally draw a Kirin as you are to draw an Ash. Even if this does prevent access to the Fire King half of the deck, you've still got to deal with the Snake Eye half, upon which you did not expend an Ash Blossom, and which is strong enough to facilitate its own tiered deck. Oh, and you're down a card. Secondly, what about original Sinful Spoils? Well, this can cut off access to Ponix or to Snake Eyes, depending on which half of the deck your opponent starts with. But the deck's got at least 6 other ways to get to the Snake Eye cards, and a number of ways to get to the Fire Kings as well. Ways that are now not vulnerable to Ash Blossom. Against the Snake Eye Pure variant, this card is also often just icing. You've got to contend with Flamberge, Whale, IP, and Princess, even without the Sinful Spoils. Thirdly, how about the effects of the individual Snake Eyes monsters? These are just kind of bad card economy. As referenced earlier, Snash usually represents 6 or 7 cards on its own. You're trading a card in hand for 1/2 of this card's effects. You might expect Ashing Snash or Oak can cut off access to Flamberge, but as decks begin weaving Divine Temple into their combo lines, it is becoming ever clearer that that's also unlikely. All these use cases are fine, but hopefully you can see that they're very often anything but turn-ending must-plays. Frequently, the card has a negligible impact on the board state. Now let's talk about the downsides to playing an Ash Blossom. Firstly, and most obviously, is Hita the Fire Charmer. Every fire deck is already playing this card. It's a way to climb through fire monsters that occasionally extends. It's a spellcaster for Selene, and importantly, it's massively punishing if you're playing Ash. In a best-case scenario where you are able to Ash Blossom an opponent's must-resolve effect, the monsters remaining on your opponent's side of the field can be linked into Hita, summoning your Ash Blossom back on the way to an early Promethean Princess. Secondly, if we're in a Tier 0 format, you can expect, as duelists were during the UDS Invitational, players may be playing Crossout Designator. If they're on 3 Crossout, your opponent will have just as many chances to find this card as you will to find Ash Blossom. This negates the effect of Ash Blossom, of course, but unlike its partner in Called by the Grave, it does not banish the card. As a result, an opponent who is playing this card can punish an Ash not only with their existing combo, also game-winning extension via the Hita line. Thirdly, often makes your second hand trap worse. Even in these videos I've shown you extolling the positives of Ash Blossom, the duelists let slip that it's a powerful card when it's paired with another high-impact hand trap. This makes sense. A number of formats have top decks that are incredibly resilient at playing through a single hand trap, but fold to 2 in sequence. Unfortunately, giving access to the Hita line often gives your opponent the ability to play around the second hand trap. Free extension may net your opponent a Princess or even a Flamberge through Divine Temple, both of which contest an in-hand Nibiru. If it's turn 2, Hita may be the difference between a Link 3 like Selene that can demand a response with an access code threat that Princess couldn't. The knowledge that Ash Blossom is no longer in play may embolden a duelist to make the decision to commit to a high-impact Fire King Island line that loses to very little outside of Ash Blossom instead of a comparable line that loses to more generic options. Hell, maybe they can even make it to Apollosa. So, what are you gonna do? I'd like to conclude on this. I'm not asking you necessarily to kill Ash Blossom, to remove it from your decks and laugh from atop a throne of contrarianism. as soon as I'm done with it. I'm asking you to consider the above discussion and determine if it's worth playing in your deck. Jesse, for instance, describes it as the 4th best hand trap, but guess what? He's playing the other 3 already. It's gonna make the cut. Rather than just putting it out to pasture or jamming it in your 55, what I'd like you to do is start engaging with your deck choices using this mental model, interrogating every slot in your deck by examining its use cases, its downsides, and how it meshes into the larger context of the rest of your strategy. Most importantly, be ready to buck unscientific, vibes-based deck decisions like, you gotta be prepared to murder your darlings. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is the best card in Yu-Gi-Oh!